Russia and Ukraine continue long-range operations as strikes hit logistics and border infrastructure. The Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant loses external power, and one Ukrainian lawmaker describes parliament's task as helping people burn in hell more comfortably. North Korea launches around 10 short-range ballistic missiles as Washington and Seoul cut Ulchi Freedom Shield short, and Trump pushes for renewed dialogue with Kim Jong Un. U.S. federal debt crosses $40 trillion for the first time as borrowing costs rise and the Treasury expands operations to support the bond market. Washington prepares a new sanctions package against Iran, while pressure on oil exports and uncertainty around the Strait of Hormuz continue reshaping regional trade. The United States targets a financial network accused of moving hundreds of millions of dollars to Hezbollah through Turkey, the Gulf, and Iran. Romania destroys a maritime drone near the strategic Neptune deep gas project as European officials warn of a broader hybrid threat in the Black Sea. And in Leaders on X, Hakan Fidan addresses Gaza, Syria, and Hormuz, Marco Rubio issues new sanctions warnings, and Sanai Takaichi highlights deeper UK-Japan security cooperation. Russia and Ukraine are continuing long-range operations across multiple regions, while new developments are also emerging on the battlefield and around critical infrastructure. Russian sources published footage claiming that a Garand drone struck the FM logistic complex near Dudarkiv in the Kyiv region. Separate reports said a jet-powered Garand 4 hit a building at the Solnekhnaya Galeria shopping complex in Kryvyi Rih. Another overnight strike damaged the Tabaki international border crossing on the Ukrainian-Moldovan frontier, forcing operations there to be suspended. On the ground, Russia's defense ministry says units of the East grouping captured Zelene in the Zaporizhzhia region after advancing through fortified Ukrainian positions. Russian military sources also reported 5 FAB-500 glide bomb strikes against what they described as a temporary deployment site of Ukraine's 159th Mechanized Brigade near Blahodatny in the Kharkiv region. These battlefield claims have not been independently verified. The Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant has meanwhile lost its last external power connection. Emergency diesel generators were automatically activated to maintain reactor cooling and spent fuel safety systems. The International Atomic Energy Agency says the damaged line is located on the northern bank of the Dnipro, but the cause of the outage has not yet been established. Ukraine's military intelligence also says North Korea has sent around 8,500 additional personnel to Russia, including roughly 400 drone operators and about 1,000 engineers and sappers. Kyiv says some of the drone specialists could support reconnaissance and strike operations from Russian territory. Kim Jong Un has rejected the claims as groundless. Another Ukrainian request now centers on Starlink. According to the Financial Times, Kyiv wants Elon Musk to allow Starlink-equipped strike drones to operate against Russian missile launchers at distances of up to 200 kilometers. The goal would be to destroy launch systems before missiles are fired and reduce dependence on scarce Patriot interceptors. Musk has not granted that permission. The political strain is also showing inside Ukraine. Verkhovna Rada Deputy Oleksandr Koltunovic said Parliament's ability to improve living conditions is severely limited by the war, describing its current task as helping Ukrainians burn in hell more comfortably. North Korea has launched around 10 short-range ballistic missiles toward the Sea of Japan as tensions rise around the latest U.S.-South Korean military exercises. South Korea's military says the missiles were fired from the Pyongyang area and fell outside Japan's exclusive economic zone. No damage to ships or aircraft was reported. The launches came during Ulchi Freedom Shield, the major annual exercise between the United States and South Korea. The drills began on August 17th and were originally scheduled to continue for 10 days. Washington and Seoul have now agreed to end them on Friday, 6 days earlier than planned, while also reducing part of the field training program. President Donald Trump pushed for a smaller American role in the exercises, describing large-scale drills as expensive and hostile. He has again emphasized his personal relationship with Kim Jong Un and says he hopes to meet the North Korean leader before the end of the year. The move is intended to create more room for diplomacy without formally weakening the U.S. alliance with South Korea. Pyongyang has rejected the idea that the reduced exercise represents a meaningful change in American policy. Kim Jong Un said Washington still treats North Korea as its principal enemy and argued that cutting the drills short does not remove what Pyongyang considers their provocative character. Her statement suggests North Korea is judging Washington by broader military policy rather than by the length of one exercise. Russia has welcomed the reduction. Moscow says smaller exercises lower the risk of escalation on the Korean peninsula and reduce what it describes as unnecessary military pressure in the region. The Russian Foreign Ministry argued that large maneuvers not aimed at common threats such as terrorism, piracy, or natural disasters undermine regional security rather than strengthen it. The missile launches therefore carry a broader political message. Washington is signaling that it is prepared to reduce military pressure in order to reopen communication, while Pyongyang is showing that it does not yet regard those concessions as sufficient. The next test will be whether the shortened exercise leads to direct contact between Trump and Kim Jong Un, or whether North Korea continues to answer diplomatic signals with additional missile activity and military demonstrations. Any further launches would quickly test whether the current de-escalation effort has produced any practical change. The United States has crossed a symbolic and increasingly costly threshold, with federal debt exceeding $40 trillion for the first time. The Treasury is now also expanding buybacks of older long-term government securities. The size of individual operations is being increased from around $2 billion to $4 billion. These transactions do not reduce the national debt. Instead, the Treasury exchanges less liquid securities for cash in an effort to improve trading conditions and support the functioning of the bond market. The move comes as long-term borrowing costs remain elevated. Yields on 30-year U.S. Treasury bonds recently climbed to their highest levels since 2007. Higher yields mean Washington must offer investors greater returns when issuing new debt, making future borrowing more expensive. That creates a growing fiscal problem. Around $32 trillion of federal debt is held by private investors, financial institutions, and other outside holders, while roughly $7.8 trillion represents obligations within the government itself. Interest costs are now one of the fastest growing parts of the federal budget. Congressional projections indicate that net federal interest payments could exceed $1 trillion this year. As more debt matures and is refinanced at higher rates, those costs can increase even if government spending elsewhere remains unchanged. Washington also faces a large refinancing requirement. Trillions of dollars in Treasury securities will mature over the coming year, while additional borrowing will still be needed to finance the federal budget deficit. The central issue is therefore not whether the United States can immediately service $40 trillion in debt. Global demand for Treasury securities still allows Washington to borrow on an enormous scale. The longer-term risk is the price of that borrowing. If investors demand persistently higher yields, interest payments will consume a larger share of the budget, forcing future governments to choose between higher taxes, slower spending growth, or still more borrowing. The United States is preparing the next phase of its economic campaign against Iran, with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent promising to present additional measures on Monday. Bessent says Washington intends to build what he described as the most extensive coordinated economic isolation campaign ever attempted. The pressure will extend beyond Iranian institutions to foreign companies, banks, and governments that continue buying Iranian oil, transferring money, or helping Tehran maintain access to international trade. He also indicated that the administration is currently prioritizing economic pressure over another major military escalation, although he stressed that any final decision remains with President Donald Trump. At the same time, the Strait of Hormuz remains a major pressure point. Iraq is seeking special passage arrangements for its oil tankers because most of its crude exports traditionally move through the strait. Baghdad has been holding intensive talks with Tehran while also examining alternative routes that could reduce its dependence on the waterway. The disruption is already changing regional shipping economics. Tanker demand has risen sharply, freight rates have increased, and Gulf exporters are adjusting transport arrangements to keep crude moving through the region. For Washington, the strategy now depends on whether major trading partners cooperate with the new restrictions. For Tehran, control over access to Hormuz remains one of its strongest sources of leverage. The next test comes on Monday, when Bessent is expected to provide the first detailed outline of how the new sanctions campaign will be enforced against Iran's external commercial network. The United States has imposed new sanctions on a financial network that Washington says moved large amounts of money to Hezbollah outside the formal banking system. The U.S. Treasury says the network was operated by Turkish businessman Yunus Alper Yilmaz and relied on couriers traveling on commercial flights between Lebanon, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran. According to the Treasury, the network was capable of moving hundreds of millions of dollars between jurisdictions, giving Hezbollah access to cash while avoiding conventional financial channels and international restrictions. Washington has also changed the way Hezbollah is designated under U.S. sanctions. The group, already under extensive restrictions, is now being explicitly identified as an Iranian proxy, acting on behalf of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Quds Force. The Treasury says the change is intended to emphasize the financial and operational relationship between Hezbollah and Iran, rather than treating the Lebanese group as an independent organization. The move comes as Washington expands pressure across Iran's wider regional network, increasingly targeting couriers, intermediaries, and commercial structures used to move money across borders. The next step will be enforcement, with U.S. authorities seeking additional financial channels, companies, and intermediaries linked to the network that could increase scrutiny of transactions moving through Turkey and Gulf financial hubs. Romanian forces have destroyed a maritime drone detected close to the Neptun Deep offshore gas project in the Black Sea. Romania's defense ministry says the unmanned vessel was discovered off the coast of Constanța, only several hundred meters from the area where work on Neptun Deep is underway. Romanian authorities scrambled F-16 fighters while naval forces moved to neutralize the object. The drone was destroyed before reaching the offshore infrastructure. Its origin has not been officially established. Defense Minister Radu Miruța said Ukraine confirmed that the vessel did not belong to Ukrainian forces, while President Nicolae Dan blamed Russia for the incident. Neptun Deep is a strategic energy project for Romania and the European Union, with gas production expected to begin in 2027. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen described the incident as part of hybrid warfare against Europe and linked it to the European Drone Defense Initiative, Readiness 2030, and stronger protection of the eastern flank. The incident adds new pressure on Romania and NATO to protect offshore energy infrastructure and shipping routes in the Black Sea. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan says he discussed Gaza, Syria, and the situation around the Strait of Hormuz with regional partners, including officials from Egypt and Saudi Arabia. He also referred to ongoing contacts involving the parties to the wider confrontation, presenting Turkey as an active diplomatic channel across several Middle Eastern crises. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio says Washington is expanding sanctions pressure and warns that foreign banks and companies could face consequences if they continue facilitating transactions involving sanctioned networks. His post reinforces the administration's broader use of secondary sanctions as an economic tool. Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi says she held her first talks with British Prime Minister Andy Burnham, focusing on deeper security and economic cooperation. The two discussed the Global Combat Air Program, advanced technologies, and economic security, presenting the UK-Japan relationship as an increasingly important strategic partnership.